She was 22 and newly orphaned, with no allies in the room and no place at the table. No brothers to speak for her, no mother to steady her hand, just a mourning dress that no longer fit at the sleeves and 11 shillings folded into a handkerchief in her pocket. And on the afternoon of her father's funeral, her uncles burned his will in the drawing-room grate at Whitford End and divided the house and the rents among themselves, leaving her a bare corner of the neglected west wing and the understanding that she should be grateful for it. But what none of them knew was that behind the old hearthstone in her father's study, sealed in wax and wrapped in oilskin, lay a second copy of that will, and everything her father had ever meant her to have. Settle in. And if a story about a young woman who refused to be swept out of her own home is one you'd like to hear to the end, take a moment to subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. Elizabeth Walker had been born at Whitford End in the last week of March 1848, in the upper bedroom that looked east across the beach avenue toward the parish road, and for the first 11 years of her life she had known the house as a warm, coal-smoked, book-filled place, where her father's voice carried through the passages and her mother's step was quick on the flagstones. Her father, Edmund Walker, was a country gentleman of no very large fortune, but of steady standing in the parish. 300 acres of decent Herefordshire land, a farmhouse tenanted by a family called Prosser, a row of 4 cottages let at modest rents, and the old manor itself, which had been in the Walker name since his grandfather's day. Her mother, Anne, had come from a Shropshire family of clergymen and had brought with her a small piano, a folio of Handel, and a habit of reading aloud in the evenings that Elizabeth remembered afterward as the shape of happiness itself. And when Anne died of a low fever in the winter of 1859, when Elizabeth was 11, the piano was closed and never quite opened again, and the house grew quieter, and her father grew quieter with it, though he never grew cold. It was in the years that followed that Elizabeth learned the house properly, not as a child moves through rooms, but as a young woman learns what a house is made of and what it needs. This was largely the work of Mrs. Hannah Byrne, the housekeeper, a Warwickshire woman then in her 60th year, widowed young and childless, who had come to Whitford End as a girl of 19 and had never left. Mrs. Byrne was a spare, dry-handed, straight-backed person who used few words and expected none in return, and she took the motherless girl under her arm without ceremony and taught her everything a woman of the house ought to know. She taught Elizabeth to keep the household books in a neat copperplate hand, to reckon a butcher's account and a coal merchant's bill, to render lard, to salt a ham, to press linen with a flat iron heated on the range, to lay a fire that would draw properly in a damp chimney, to mix a poultice of comfrey and mustard, and to distinguish the sound of a rotten sash cord from a merely stiff one. She taught her, above all, to see a room, to walk into it and know at once what was sound and what was failing and what could be saved by a shilling's worth of work. Her father, for his part, taught her to read Latin passably and English properly, and to sit with him in the study of an evening while he answered his letters and worked at the estate ledgers. And it was there, more than anywhere, that Elizabeth came to understand what her father owned, and what he owed, and what he intended. He was a careful man, and a fair one, and he was not blind to his brothers. Of his 2 younger brothers, Mr. Roger Walker, a wine merchant in Bristol, and Mr. Thomas Walker, a barrister's clerk in London, he spoke seldom and never warmly, and once, when Elizabeth was 17 and helping him seal a packet for his solicitor in Hereford, he had laid his hand on her sleeve and said very quietly that a man's will was a fragile thing in a house full of interested parties, and that he had taken care that hers should not be. She had not fully understood him then, and he had not explained further, but the sentence had lodged in her memory the way certain sentences do, and it would return to her. She had one further possession that mattered more than any other, and that was a small silver thimble that had been her mother's, plainly engraved with the initials AMW for Anne Margaret Walker, worn smooth on the working face from years of use, and kept in a little velvet-lined box on the mantel of her bedroom. Elizabeth had learned to sew on that thimble, first under her mother's hands and then under Mrs. Burns, and she wore it whenever she took up a needle, which was often, for she had a good hand at plain sewing and a better one at mending, and she liked the quiet of the work. She carried the thimble with her from room to room in her apron pocket, and on the day her father died in the March of 1870, quietly, in his own bed, of a chill that had settled in his chest, she was sitting beside him with the thimble on her finger and a torn shirt cuff across her knee, and when he ceased to breathe she went on stitching for a full minute before she understood that she was alone. She was 22 years old. Mrs. Byrne, then past 70 and grown lame with rheumatism, had gone the year before to live with a sister in Coventry, and had written twice since in her careful, unhurried hand, and Elizabeth had written back, and the letters were folded in the drawer of her father's desk. There were no near cousins in the parish. There was the vicar, Mr. Pember, who had known her since her christening, and there was her father's solicitor, Mr. Ainsworth, in Hereford, who had drawn up the will 3 years before and lodged the original with the estate papers at Whitford End, as her father had specifically requested. And there were her 2 uncles, who arrived from Bristol and London within 4 days of the funeral wire being sent, dressed in black and full of tender concern for their niece's future. Roger Walker was the elder of the 2 by some years, a broad, high-colored man in a good black frock coat, with the confident manner of one who had prospered by knowing what other men wanted before they knew it themselves. Thomas was thinner, drier, quieter, a clerk's stoop about his shoulders, and a pair of small steel spectacles that he polished on his handkerchief whenever he wished to appear thoughtful. They stayed at Whitford End for the 4 days between their arrival and the funeral, and in that time they were, on the surface, decent enough. They spoke gently to Elizabeth at meals. They complimented the mutton. They walked the beech avenue in the afternoon with their hands clasped behind their backs, and they went twice out to the Prosser farm and once along the row of 4 cottages, and they looked at the slates and the gates and the state of the hedgerows with the interested eyes of men reckoning up a sum. The funeral was on a raw Thursday. Mr. Pember read the service in the parish church, and Edmund Walker was laid beside Anne Margaret Walker in the churchyard under the yew, and the mourners came back to Whitford End for cake and sherry, and by 3 o'clock the last of them had gone, and only Elizabeth and her 2 uncles and the parlour-maid remained in the house. Roger asked the maid to bring more coal, and when she had built the fire up, he sent her away and shut the drawing-room door. He had a packet of papers under his arm. He set them on the table beside the sherry decanter, and he said, in a voice pitched for reasonableness, that it was best to settle these things at once, while they were all together and while feeling was warm, and Thomas, standing by the window with his hands behind him, nodded. Roger untied the packet. He held up a folded document with a red seal along its edge, and he said that this was Edmund's will, drawn by Mr. Ainsworth in the November of 1867, and that having read it over between themselves that morning, they had found it, in their considered view, unjust to the family name, unjust to the Walker line, unjust in leaving so heavy a burden of land and house upon a young woman with no husband and no experience of business. He said this without raising his voice. He said it, as a man says a thing he has already decided. Elizabeth stood by the mantel with her hands folded in front of her mourning dress, which was tight at the sleeves because it had been made for her mother's funeral 11 years before and let out twice since. She said nothing. Thomas, from the window, said that they had agreed between themselves upon a more sensible arrangement, one that would keep the estate in capable hands and provide for Elizabeth in a manner suited to her sex and years. And Roger, without waiting for her answer, without asking for one, opened the door of the grate with the poker and laid the will upon the coals. The paper caught quickly. The red seal ran and blackened. Elizabeth watched it curl at the edges and lift a little in the draught and go gray, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and inside the pocket of her apron her hand closed once around the silver thimble and held it. The parlour-maid was not in the room. Mr. Pember was not in the room. Mr. Ainsworth was 25 miles away in Hereford. There were only the 3 of them and the fire, and by the time the paper was ash, Roger Walker was already drawing a second, thinner sheet from his packet and laying it flat upon the table. It was, he said, a memorandum of family understanding. Thomas would take the house and its immediate grounds. Roger would take the 300 acres and the Prosser tenancy and the rents from the 4 cottages. The movable furniture would be divided between them by inventory. And Elizabeth, dear Elizabeth, should have the West Wing rooms for her use as long as she remained unmarried and of good conduct, together with such of her own clothes and personal effects as were plainly hers, and a small quarterly sum which they would settle upon her at their discretion. He said she was to sign at the foot in witness that she agreed, and Thomas dipped the pen and held it out to her across the table. Elizabeth crossed the room and looked at the paper. She read it through once, slowly, in the coal-smoked light. She set the pen back into the standish without touching the ink to it. She said, quite evenly, that she would not sign that day. Roger's color rose a little. Thomas's spectacles caught the fire. She said good night to them both, and she went out of the drawing-room, and she went up the back stair to her bedroom on the east side of the house, and she shut the door, and turned the key, and she sat down on the edge of her bed, with the 11 shillings still folded in the handkerchief in her pocket, and the silver thimble on her finger, and she did not cry. She sat there until the house was quiet. Then she rose, and by the light of a single candle she laid out on the counterpane what was plainly hers: 3 wool dresses, 2 cotton, an apron, 2 shifts, a pair of stockings darned at the heel, her mother's shawl of grey worsted, the thimble in its velvet-lined box, the folio of Handel that her mother had brought from Shropshire, and the 2 letters from Mrs. Byrne in their unhurried Warwickshire hand. She folded these into the small leather trunk that had been her mother's before her. She took down her father's ledger from the shelf beside her bed and laid it on top, and she closed the lid. She did not leave the house. There was nowhere in the parish for her to go at that hour, and she had no intention of appearing on Mr. Pember's doorstep at midnight in a morning dress with a trunk. She did what her uncles had told her, exactly and no more. In the grey light of the following morning she carried her trunk herself, one end at a time, down the length of the long upper corridor, past the shut door of her father's study, past the linen press and the empty schoolroom, and through the baize door that separated the main house from the neglected west wing. The wing had not been slept in for above 20 years. The corridor beyond the baize door smelt of soot and cold plaster and mice. The runner on the floor had gone through in places to the boards. There were 3 rooms on the upper floor and 2 below, and Elizabeth chose the upper room at the end because it faced south and had a chimney and a window that still opened on its cord. She set the trunk down under the window. She stood a moment in the grey morning light with her hands at her sides, and she counted the rooms she would need to make habitable, and the shillings she had for the making, and the days between now and the first quarterly sum her uncles might or might not choose to pay her. Then she took off her bonnet, and she took her apron out of the trunk and tied it on, and she went to find a broom. The broom she found was in a cupboard under the back stair, and it was worn down to a stub on one side from years of sweeping in the same direction, and it would do. She carried it back through the baize door and set to work in the south room. The chimney was foul with old jackdaw's nest and soot, and the grate was rusted red, and the boards under the window were pale where damp had risen and dark where it had dried out again. There were 3 panes cracked in the sash and 1 gone altogether, stuffed with a rag that had once been blue. The paper on the walls had been a small green sprig on cream and was now a general brown, lifting at the seams. The ceiling above the bed had a long stain the shape of a leaf where a slate had slipped in some winter she did not remember. The fireplace was of local sandstone with a plain molded lintel, and the hearthstone was a single slab of grey flag, worn hollow in the middle from a century of feet. The bed was an iron frame with no mattress. The washstand had a marble top cracked across the corner and a jug with the handle glued. She swept the room out to the corridor and the corridor out to the head of the stair. She carried down 2 buckets of soot in the coal scuttle she found on the landing, and she carried up a bucket of well water from the yard pump. She washed the window in the 2 panes that were whole, and she washed the sill and the skirting, and she washed the boards along the wall where she meant to lay her mother's shawl until she could contrive a rug. She went down to the kitchen at midday and found the parlor maid gone and the range cold, and on the deal table a note in Thomas's small hand saying that the servants had been given a week's wages and dismissed pending the settlement of the household, and that the kitchen was not for Elizabeth's use until such time as arrangements were made. Elizabeth read the note through, folded it, and put it in her apron pocket beside the thimble. She went to the scullery, drew a second bucket, took a heel of yesterday's bread from the crock and half a wedge of cheese from the meat safe, ate standing at the scullery window, and went back up to her wing. In the afternoon, she opened the 2 other upper rooms and made an inventory in the back of her father's ledger, a chest of drawers with 3 drawers working and 1 stuck, a horsehair chair with the seat gone, a small oak table with 1 leg spliced, a chamber pot cracked but usable, a set of fire irons black with rust but sound, a tin candlestick, an empty deal press, a stack of yellowed newspapers from 1847, and a framed engraving of Hereford Cathedral with the glass gone. In one of the lower rooms, she found a small kitchen range set into the chimney breast, iron, of an older pattern than the one in the main kitchen, with the flue plate lying on the floor beside it. She knelt down and looked up the flue with a candle, and found it clear enough for a jackdaw or 2, but nothing that a good sweep could not settle. She wrote in the ledger, "Range in lower back room, sound, wants blacking, and a flue plate refitted." She wrote, 3 window panes, 1 sash cord, 4 slates above south upper room, 1 hearthstone loose. She had not known the hearthstone in the south upper room was loose, but as she came back up the stair in the last of the gray afternoon, she had felt it rock a little under her boot when she stepped across it, and she had added it to the list because that was what Mrs. Byrne had taught her to do with any sound a floor made that a floor should not. That evening she sat on the boards by the cold grate in the south upper room with a candle at her elbow and looked at the hearthstone. It was a plain gray flag, about 2 feet by 3, worn hollow in the middle. She had swept it clean an hour before, and now, seen close, she could see that the mortar around 3 of its edges was old and gray and set hard, and along the 4th edge, the one nearest the room, the mortar was of a paler color and softer, and had been picked at in a straight line as though someone had lifted the stone and set it back not so many years ago. She fetched the poker from the bundle of fire irons and knelt down. She worked the point of the poker along the pale seam. The soft mortar came away in dry crumbs. She worked all along that edge, and then along a hand's breadth of each side edge, until she had cleared a channel deep enough to take her fingers. She set the poker down. She hooked her fingers under the flag and lifted. The stone was heavier than she had expected, and she had to set her knee against the fender and take it in 2 lifts, but it came up, and she slid it aside onto the boards. Under the hearthstone was a shallow cavity lined with brick, about 18 inches square and 6 inches deep. In it lay an oilskin bundle tied with tarred twine, and beside the bundle a small tin box of the kind that had once held tea, and beside the tin box a folded square of paper tied with a black ribbon, and under all these an older parcel wrapped in a piece of coarse sacking, brown with age. Elizabeth sat back on her heels and looked at these things by the candle. Then she lifted them out one by one and set them on the boards beside her. She untied the tarred twine on the oilskin bundle first, because that was the largest, and the oilskin had been folded twice and creased sharp, and inside it was a document sealed in red wax with the imprint of Mr. Ainsworth's ring. The heading was the last will and testament of Edmund Walker of Whitford End in the county of Hereford, dated the 11th day of November in the year 1867, and along the fold, in her father's hand, was written, "Second copy, lodged by me, for E.W. in case of interference." It was the will her uncles had burned. It was the same will, drawn by the same hand, sealed by the same solicitor on the same day, and it lay whole and unopened in her lap. She held it a long time before she set it down. Then she opened the tin box. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of black silk, were 22 sovereigns in a neat stack, and a small purse of half-sovereigns and shillings, and folded flat beneath them a 5-pound note. She counted the coin twice by candlelight and wrote nothing in the ledger yet. Then she took up the folded square of paper tied with the black ribbon and untied it, and it was a letter in her father's hand, addressed on the outside simply, "For Elizabeth, to be read alone." The letter she folded again and slid inside the front boards of the ledger, unread by any eye but her own, and then she wrapped the sovereigns and the purse and the note back into the black silk, set them into the tin, put the tin into the trunk under her mother's shawl, and laid the sealed will flat between two leaves of the handle folio. She replaced the hearthstone in its bed and packed the pale mortar back along the fourth edge with a knife, and she banked the loose crumbs with soot from the grate so that the seam looked as it had that afternoon. Only then did she blow out the candle and sleep 4 hours in the horsehair chair with the seat gone, wrapped in the gray worsted shawl. The following morning, before Roger or Thomas had come down, Elizabeth walked the 5 miles into the market town in her morning dress with a shilling and sixpence in her pocket and the sealed will sewn flat inside the lining of her bodice. She took the 8 o'clock carrier's cart from the crossroads the last 4 miles into Hereford and paid 4 pence for the seat. She was at Mr. Ainsworth's door in Church Street by 10:30. Mr. Ainsworth was 61, spare, grey-whiskered, and had known Edmund Walker for 30 years. He received her in his front office with the fire lit and the door shut, and when she laid the sealed document on his blotter and told him plainly what had been burned in the drawing-room grate at Whitford End 4 days before, he did not exclaim. He read the endorsement in Edmund's hand along the fold, broke the seal himself with a bone knife, read the will through twice in silence, and then said only that it was in order, that it was the true and lodged copy, that his own clerk had witnessed it, and that they would have the matter before the county court within the month. By evening Elizabeth was back in the West Wing with a written affidavit in her trunk, a receipt for the will now in Mr. Ainsworth's strong room, and a note in Mr. Ainsworth's hand for Mr. Pember. She walked the half-mile to the vicarage the next morning and put the note into Mr. Pember's hand at his own door. Mr. Pember was 73, thin, white-haired, had christened her, and read the note twice on the step before he asked her in. He set her by his study fire, gave her a cup of tea and a slice of seed cake, and said that he had been present in the drawing-room the afternoon of the funeral until 3 o'clock, and had seen the sealed will lying on Edmund's desk in the study 3 weeks before Edmund's death when he had called on him, and that he would swear to both facts before any court in England. The county summons was served on Roger Walker and Thomas Walker in the 2nd week of April by a clerk of Mr. Ainsworth's in the drawing-room where they had burned the first copy. Roger went red to the collar. Thomas polished his spectacles. Neither of them spoke to Elizabeth that day beyond civilities, and neither of them entered the West Wing. The hearing was set for the 12th of May at the Shire Hall. In the meantime, Elizabeth worked. She paid 2 shillings to Job Hurley, a slater of the village, aged 44, a widower with 3 grown daughters, to bring his ladder and his hammer and refit the 4 slipped slates above the south upper room. He did it in an afternoon and would take only 1 shilling in the end because, he said, he had drunk Edmund Walker's ale at harvest for 20 years. She paid 9 pence to William Prosser, the tenant of the farm, aged 50, broad-shouldered, slow of speech, for the loan of his cart to fetch a straw mattress and 100 weight of coal from the yard at the crossroads. He brought them himself and would take no coin for the driving. Mrs. Prosser, 46, sent up a basin of pea soup covered with a cloth, and later a jar of pickled damsons, and later still a fresh loaf every Tuesday until the end of April. Elizabeth engaged Ellen Rudd, 17, a labourer's daughter from the row of 4 cottages, at 8 pence a day, to scrub the boards of the south upper room, the corridor, and the 2 lower rooms, and to wash the ceiling with warm water and a little vinegar until the leaf-shaped stain paled to grey. She had John Marlowe, the glazier from the market town, aged 38, cut and fit 3 new panes at 1 shilling apiece and record the sash. He did the work in 1 long morning and drank tea in the corridor from a chipped cup. She had a chimney sweep named Peter Nunn, aged 22, brush the south flue and the flue of the small kitchen range in the lower back room. He charged her 1 shilling and 6 pence for the 2 together and gave her a bag of soot for the garden. She blacked the small kitchen range herself with a tin of zebra polish bought for 4 pence. refitted the flue plate with fresh fireclay from Mr. Hurley's remaining bucket, laid a fire of sticks and coal, and had a kettle boiling on it before dusk of the 5th day. From that evening she cooked her own porridge, her own tea, her own boiled bacon and potatoes in her own wing, on her own range, and did not enter the main kitchen at all. Mr. Pember came up on the 7th day and again on the 10th, and sat at the small oak table with the spliced leg while Elizabeth wrote out in her father's ledger a statement of what had passed in the drawing-room on the afternoon of the funeral, the names of those present, the burning of the sealed document, the wording of the memorandum, the pen offered and set back into the standish without ink. Mr. Pember read it, signed it as witness to her signing, and took a fair copy for Mr. Ainsworth in his own hand. On the 12th of May, at the Shire Hall in Hereford, Mr. Ainsworth laid the second copy of the will before the county court, and Mr. Pember gave his evidence, and the clerk who had witnessed the will in November of 1867 gave his, and Ellen Rudd, who had been the parlour maid on the afternoon of the funeral and had built up the fire before being sent away, gave hers in a plain, steady voice and a borrowed bonnet. Roger and Thomas were represented by a Bristol attorney who argued in vain that the memorandum represented a family understanding and that the second copy had been improperly lodged. The court found for Elizabeth Walker before dinner. The memorandum was set aside. The estate was ordered restored to her as sole devise under the will of Edmund Walker, dated the 11th day of November 1867, and the costs were laid upon Roger and Thomas jointly. Roger left Whitford End that same evening in the fly from the George. Thomas stayed a further day to gather his papers, and then took the London train from Hereford. Neither shook Elizabeth's hand at parting. Neither has since crossed the beech avenue. Elizabeth did not move at once into the main house. She stayed in the south upper room of the west wing through the summer, because the work she had begun there was not finished, and because it was quieter, and because it was hers by her own labor before it was hers by any deed. She had the leaf-shaped stain painted over in July with 2 coats of whitewash, and Ellen Rudd papered the walls in September with a small rose pattern bought in the market at 5d. a yard. She engaged Mrs. Prosser's younger sister, Sarah Hollis, age 39, widowed, a good plain cook, as housekeeper at £14 a year and her keep, and Ellen Rudd stayed on as maid at £10. She wrote a long letter to Mrs. Byrne in Coventry describing everything from the burning of the will to the finding of the hearthstone to the verdict at the Shire Hall, and Mrs. Byrne wrote back in her unhurried Warwickshire hand a letter of 4 pages, which Elizabeth folded into her father's ledger beside the earlier 2. Through the autumn she went into the main rooms one at a time. She had Mr. Marlowe re-lead a window in the drawing-room where the burning had blackened the ceiling above the grate. She had the grate itself taken out and the chimney swept twice and a new fire basket set. She had the piano tuned, for the first time in 11 years, by a man named Robert Thynne from Ledbury, aged 56, who came out on the carrier's cart with his tools in a green baize bag and worked at it for a day and a half and asked at the end whether the young lady played. Elizabeth said she did not, but that her mother had. Mr. Thynne bowed and said the instrument would keep now for whoever came to it. She kept up her father's ledgers. She met William Prosser once a quarter in the study, and settled the farm rent in shillings and pence at the same desk where Edmund had settled it, and she rode out on a hired pony along the 4 cottages every Michaelmas to collect the rents herself, in a plain grey wool dress, with the silver thimble in her apron pocket. Old Mr. Hurley, the slater, she engaged by the year for the roofs. Mr. Pember dined at Whitford End every second Sunday and read aloud from the Handel folio afterwards, while Sarah Hollis cleared the plates. By Christmas, the parish had settled to calling her Miss Walker of Whitford End without hesitation, and the children of the 4 cottages curtsied to her at the church gate, and the men at the Prosser farm touched their caps in the lane, and there was no one in the village who did not know that she had gone into court in a black dress in May and come out with her father's house. On a still evening in the last week of March, on the 1st anniversary of Edmund Walker's death and Elizabeth's 23rd birthday, Elizabeth sat in the study at Whitford End at her father's desk with the ledger open before her and the lamp trimmed low. The room was as Edmund had kept it, with the books on the shelves in the order he had left them. and the estate papers in the drawer at her right hand, and the hearth swept and laid for the next morning's fire. On the desk in front of her, side by side on a square of black silk, were two objects. The first was the small silver thimble engraved AMW, worn smooth on its working face, taken that afternoon out of her apron pocket. The second was a plain iron key of no lock now in the house, which had lain wrapped in the oilskin bundle behind the hearthstone with the sealed will and the tin of sovereigns, and which she had kept as her father's last small parcel to her. Beside them, folded once, was the letter that had been addressed for Elizabeth, to be read alone, and which she had read that first candlelit night and every March since. She did not read it now. She only laid her hand flat on it for a moment, as one lays a hand on a shoulder. She thought of Mrs. Byrne in Coventry, who had taught her to note any sound a floor made that a floor should not, and whose 4-page letter of the previous May was folded into the ledger under her hand. She thought of her mother, dead these 12 years, whose thimble had sat with her while Roger Walker held a document over the coals, and whose piano now stood tuned in the drawing-room for whoever might come to it. She thought of her father, who had told her at 17 that a man's will was a fragile thing in a house full of interested parties and had taken care that hers should not be, and who had lifted the flag of the hearthstone one afternoon she had never seen, and set his second copy under it and packed the pale mortar back along the fourth edge with his own hand. She thought of Roger Walker in Bristol and Thomas Walker in London, who had believed a girl of 22 in a tight morning dress with 11 shillings in her pocket had nothing at her back, and who had learned in a court at Hereford that she had a great deal. She closed the ledger and put out the lamp. She carried the thimble in her hand across the hall and up the stair to the east bedroom, the upper bedroom facing the Beach Avenue, in which she had been born in the last week of March in 1848, and which Sarah Hollis had aired and made up that week for her return to it. She laid the thimble in its velvet-lined box on the mantel, where it had lain all her childhood. Downstairs, Sarah Hollis banked the kitchen range for the night, and Ellen Rudd shot the bolt on the scullery door, and the house was quiet, in the way it had been quiet when she was a child, and warm, in the way it had been warm then, and hers in a way it had not been then, and was now. Elizabeth Walker was 22 and newly orphaned. She had 11 shillings folded in a handkerchief and a silver thimble in her apron pocket, and they left her a corner of a neglected wing and expected her to be grateful. It was the best corner she ever swept. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who has ever been counted out of a room and quietly counted themselves back in. And before you go, sit with this. What have you been handed that others called nothing, and what might be waiting for you underneath it, if only you thought to lift the stone?